She found him buried under a rock slide in a canyon she had never seen before. A stranger with gray eyes and blood on his face whispering a name that was not his own. She gave him half her last piece of cornbread when she was starving. She sat up all night when his fever tried to kill him. And when the truth finally came out, when she learned who he really was, she discovered something that changed everything. She had saved the life of the man who had abandoned her at the train station. The same man who had sent for her as his bride. But here's the thing about secrets, my friend. They have a way of multiplying, and the secret he was keeping was nothing compared to the one she had been hiding all along. This is that story. My friend, come sit with me a while. Pour yourself something warm and settle into your chair, because this is a story that asks for patience the way a good fire asks for tending. It is a story about two people who had given up on trust about bread, shared when there was none to spare, and about the kind of love that does not arrive with trumpets and fanfare, but creeps in quiet like dawn through a cabin window. My grandmother used to say that God writes straight with crooked lenses. I never understood what she meant until I heard this tale. Now I believe she was right. There is a particular quality to loneliness that only those who have truly known it can recognize. It is not simply being alone. A man can be alone on a mountaintop and feel the presence of the whole world in the wind and the stone. No true loneliness is standing in a crowd and knowing that not a single soul would notice if you vanished. It is watching life flow past you like a river you cannot touch. Eleanor Whitmore knew that loneliness intimately. She had grown up with it in the cramped boarding house rooms of Chicago, in the spaces between her mother's labored breasts during those final terrible months. But standing on the weathered platform of Copper Springs Station in the Montana Territory, watching the train shrink to a dark speck against the white horizon, she discovered a new variety of silence altogether. This was the emptiness of being utterly alone in a land she did not know, waiting for a man she had never met, clutching a letter full of promises that now felt thin as the paper they were written on. The station master squinted at the letter like it might bite him. He was a grizzled man with tobacco-stained fingers and a beard that had seen better decades. His eyes moved slowly across the words, lips forming each one as though reading were a physical labor. Thornton, you say? He turned the paper over, held it up to the fading light that pushed weakly through the dirty window. Samuel Thornton, yes, sir. Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had learned young that showing weakness was like bleeding in front of wolves. It only invited attack. He was supposed to meet me here. The smell of coal smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the sharp bite of snow and something else. Something wild and unfamiliar. Pine, perhaps, or sage, scents she had never known in Chicago, where the air tasted of factories and crowded streets. The old man scratched his jaw. Gray stubble rasped against his calloused palm like sandpaper on wood. Well, miss, I know who Samuel Thornton is. Everybody in these parts knows the Thornton name. He owns Blackstone Ranch, biggest spread between here and the Canadian border. Eleanor's heart lifted for a moment, then sank again when she saw his face. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like pity, or perhaps warning. But I ain't seen nobody from Blackstone come through today. He handed the letter back and that pitying look deepened. Not yesterday neither. You sure you got the right day? She unfolded the letter again, though she had memorized every word weeks ago. December 15th, it said. Today was December 15th. She had counted the days on the train like a child counting down to Christmas, marking each one off with a mixture of terror and hope. I am certain, she said. The station master shrugged the slow and heavy shrug of a man who had seen too many disappointed faces on this platform. Young women arriving with hope in their eyes and leaving with something broken in their chests. Could be he got held up. Ranch work does not keep to any schedule, especially this time of year. Could be tomorrow. Could be never, for all anybody knows. Eleanor felt the words land in her stomach like stones dropped into still water. She had sold nearly everything she owned to buy that train ticket, keeping only the few treasures she could not bear to part with. Had given up her job at the laundry, surrendered her room at the boarding house. Everything she possessed in this world now fit inside the battered leather valise at her feet. How far is it to town, she asked. The station master blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Beg pardon, the town, Crestwood. How far is it? About 12 miles west. He gestured vaguely toward where the sun was bleeding red into the hills, staining the snow pink and gold. But miss, it will be dark in 2 hours, and that road through Ridgeback Pass is not safe for a woman alone. Weather is turning too. I can smell snow coming. Is there a shorter way? His eyebrows climbed toward his hat brim. He studied her for a long moment, this thin woman in her faded wool dress with her hair escaping from its pins, and desperation written in every line of her body. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. Her features were too sharp, her frame too spare. But there was something in her eyes that made him pause, a fire that had not yet gone out. There is a path through Ridgeback Canyon. He spoke slowly as though the words were being pulled from him against his will. Cuts 3 miles off the journey, maybe more. Follow the creek bed till you see a rock, shaped like a broken tooth. Bear left there and keep on till you hit the main road. Thank you kindly. Eleanor picked up her valise. The leather handle was worn smooth from her mother's hands, then her own. Everything she owned fit inside it. 2 dresses, 1 wool shawl that had been her mother's, a small leather journal filled with notes about herbs and medicines in her mother's careful handwriting, and a tintype photograph so faded she could barely make out the faces anymore. Miss, she paused at the edge of the platform. The station master's voice stopped her, and when she turned, she saw something different in his face. Not pity now, but concern. You sure about this? Next train comes through Thursday. You could wait here, send word to the ranch. Might be safer. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Looked at the empty platform, the dirty windows, the pot-bellied stove giving off its meager heat. Then she looked out at the wilderness stretching before her, white and vast and terrifying. I have done enough waiting, she said. I reckon I will take my chances with the canyon. She stepped off the platform onto the packed snow. The cold hit her immediately, seeping through her thin boots and wrapping around her ankles like icy hands. The smell of pine and sage filled her lungs, strange and sharp. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Eleanor touched the pocket where she kept her mother's brass watch, felt its familiar weight against her hip. Her mother had wound that watch every night before bed, right up until her hands grew too weak to turn the stem. Keep moving forward, Clara girl, her mother used to say. Though her name was Eleanor, her mother had always called her by her middle name, the name she had been given after her grandmother. The Lord helps those who help themselves. Eleanor squared her shoulders against the cold and started walking. The canyon swallowed sound the way a well swallows stones. Eleanor had been walking for nearly an hour, her breath coming in clouds of white vapor that hung in the still air before slowly dissolving. The walls of Ridgeback rose on either side, not tall but steep enough to block the wind and trap what little warmth remained from the dying day. She was grateful for that small mercy. The wind had been brutal out on the open plain, cutting through her wool dress like it was made of paper. Here in the canyon, the air was cold but still, and she could feel her fingers and toes again, though they ached with the memory of the bitter cold. Her valise grew heavier with each step. She shifted it from hand to hand, trying to give her aching arms some relief. Her boots were not made for this terrain. They were city boots meant for cobblestone streets and wooden boardwalks, not rocky creek beds and patches of ice. Twice she stumbled. Once she fell, her knee striking a hidden rock beneath the snow. She sat there for a moment, breathing hard, fighting the urge to pray. What kind of man does not come to meet his bride? The question had been circling in her mind like a vulture ever since she stepped off the train. She had read his letter so many times she could recite it from memory. Dear Miss Whitmore, I am a man of few words and fewer graces, but I am honest and I will be good to you. The West is hard country, but there is beauty here if you know where to look. I have land a sturdy house in need of a companion. If you are willing to take a chance on a stranger, I will meet you at Copper Springs Station on December 15th. Respectfully yours, S. Thornton. 52 words. She had staked her entire life on 52 words from a man she had never seen. Foolish girl, whispered a voice in her head that sounded like her mother but sharper, meaner. The voice of fever and pain. What did you expect? A fairy tale. Eleanor pushed herself up from the snow, brushing off her skirts with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. I am not foolish, she said aloud, and her voice sounded strange in the canyon silence, thin and small. I am brave. There is a difference, Arnold. She picked up her valise and kept walking. The light was failing fast. Shadows pooled in the low places like dark water, and the sky above the canyon walls had turned from pale blue to deep purple streaked with orange and pink. It was beautiful, she realized. Beautiful in a way that Chicago had never been with its soot-stained buildings and gray skies. But beauty would not keep her warm tonight. Beauty would not fill her empty stomach or guide her feet on an unfamiliar path. She was so lost in thought that she almost did not see the horse. It appeared around a bend in the canyon like a ghost, and Eleanor froze her hand tightening on the handle of her valise. Not that it would do much good as a weapon, but a body had to hold on to something when fear came knocking. The horse was tall, a chestnut with a white blaze on its forehead. It stood in the middle of the path, reins trailing in the snow, watching her with large liquid eyes that reflected the dying light. Dried foam crusted its neck and chest. Wherever it had come from, it had been running hard. There was no rider. Easy, Eleanor murmured, stepping closer. Easy now. The horse snorted, ears flicking forward, but it did not bolt. Its flank twitched when she reached for the reins. That was when she saw the blood. Dark stains on the saddle, smeared along the horse's right side. Too much blood to be from a scratch or a scrape. Far too much. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Her eyes followed the trail of disturbed snow, the scuff marks and displaced stones that led around a tumble of boulders toward a section of the canyon wall where fresh rockfall had spilled across the path. Walk away, said the sensible voice in her head, the voice of survival, of self-preservation. Get on the horse. Ride to town. Find help. But her mother's voice said something different. The real voice, the kind one, the one she had heard every day of her childhood until the consumption took it away. When you see someone in need, Clara girl, you do not walk past. That is not who we are. That is not who I raised you to be. Her feet were already moving before she made the conscious decision to follow. The rocks were the color of old rust in the fading light. Some were small as fists, others large as barrels. They had come down from the canyon rim recently. She could see the fresh scar on the wall above pale stone against the weathered red of the cliff face. She climbed over the first boulder, then the second, her skirts catching on the rough edges and tearing. She did not stop. And then she saw him. A hand jutted out from beneath a slab of granite, fingers curled toward the purple sky. Motionless. A man's hand, broad palm and calloused fingers, with a simple silver ring on the third finger. Eleanor dropped her valise and scrambled over the remaining rocks, heedless of the sharp edges that sliced her palms and tore at her dress. The man lay on his side, half buried under the slide. His face was turned away, but she could see the rise and fall of his chest. Shallow, labored, but there. He was alive. Mister, she knelt beside him, her hands hovering uselessly. Mister, can you hear me? No response. His hat had fallen somewhere in the slide. Dark hair matted with blood and dust, a deep gash across his forehead that was still seeping, painting one side of his face red. His left leg was pinned beneath a rock too heavy for her to move alone. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at the skeek. The last light was draining away like water from a broken cup. Purple was giving way to black, and the first stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant. She looked at the unconscious stranger, at the blood still flowing from his wound, at the impossible weight of the stone on his leg. The sensible choice was still to ride for help. Leave him here, find the town, bring back men with tools and horses. But the blood was still flowing, and the temperature was dropping fast, and she remembered what her mother had taught her about head wounds. How quickly the cold could creep in. How fast a body could give up when it started to fail. She thought of her mother's words, of the person she wanted to be, of the person she had promised to become. Lord, she prayed silently, her eyes closed against the fading light. I do not know if I am doing the right thing. I do not know if I can save him, but I cannot leave him here to die alone in the dark. Please give me strength. She opened her eyes, she rolled up her sleeves. The smaller rocks came away first. Eleanor's fingernails split against the granite, leaving bloody crescents on the stone, but she did not stop. Each stone she pulled free revealed more of the man beneath. His shoulder, the curve of his back, the torn fabric of what had once been a good wool shirt, now dark with blood and dirt. The smell of blood was sharp in the cold air, metallic and unsettling, mixed with dust and the faint scent of pine from the trees above the canyon rim. His breathing changed, hitched. A low groan escaped his cracked lips. Hold on. Eleanor wiped her palms on her ruined skirt, leaving dark smears across the fabric. I am getting you out. The slab pinning his leg was the problem. It was flat and heavy, wedged at an angle against a larger boulder. She guessed it weighed at least 200 pounds, maybe more. She braced her shoulder against the cold stone. Pushed. Her boots scraped against loose gravel, finding no purchase. The rock shifted barely an inch. Maybe two. Not enough. Eleanor repositioned herself, dug her heels into a crack between two stones, pushed again harder this time until her arms shook and spots danced at the edges of her vision. The canyon walls seemed to lean closer, trapping the last heat of the day against her straining body. Something in her back screamed in protest. She ignored it. The slab scraped sideways with a grinding sound that echoed off the canyon walls. His leg came free. Eleanor collapsed against the boulder chest, heaving her breath coming in great white clouds that hung in the freezing air. Her hands were raw and bleeding, the skin torn in a dozen places. The copper smell of her own blood mixed with his, with the dust, with the faint sage scent carried on the evening breeze. For a moment, she simply sat there, breathing, existing, wondering what in the name of heaven she had gotten herself into. Then the man's eyes opened. Gray. Pale gray like the winter sky before snow. They fixed on her face unfocused, at first struggling to make sense of what they saw. His lips moved. No sound came out. Eleanor reached for the canteen she had spotted on the horse's saddle, battered leather worn smooth with use. She unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers, lifted his head with one hand, and tipped a small amount of water against his cracked lips. He swallowed, coughed, swallowed again. Water. His voice was barely more than a rasp, like sandpaper on raw wood. I know. Easy now, not too fast. His eyes drifted shut, opened again. Fixed on her with something approaching clarity. Who another cough wet and rattling in his chest. Who are you? Does not matter right now. Eleanor set down the canteen and turned her attention to his leg. The ankle was swollen, already purpling in the dying light. But the bone had not broken through the skin. Small mercies. The gash on his forehead was worse than she had thought. Deep enough to show white beneath the red, the edges ragged and already beginning to swell. It needed cleaning, stitching, things she could not do here in the gathering darkness. There is a cabin. His voice was barely a whisper now. 1/2 mile. Follow the creek. Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp in her arms. Eleanor looked up at the sky, now fully dark and blazing with more stars than she had ever seen. Looked at the horse standing patiently nearby. Looked at the unconscious man who weighed at least twice what she did. 1/2 mile in the dark with a man she could barely move. It seemed impossible. But impossible had been her companion for 7 years now. She had survived her mother's death, survived the streets of Chicago, survived poverty and hunger and the kind of loneliness that ate at your soul like rust on iron. She would survive this too. Getting him onto the horse nearly broke her. Eleanor hooked her arms under his shoulders, grunting with the effort, and pulled. His boots dragged furrows in the snow, leaving dark trails that would freeze to ice by morning. Dead weight. That was what folks called it, and now she understood why. Every muscle in her back screamed. Her knees buckled twice before she managed to prop him against a boulder. Sweat poured down her face despite the cold freezing in her hair and on her eyelashes. The horse stood patient, watching with those liquid eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. Its breath came warm against Eleanor's cheek when she finally wrestled the unconscious man close enough to attempt the mount. Come on now, she grabbed his belt with one hand, his shirt collar with the other. You have got to help me, just a little. Something flickered across his face. Consciousness, maybe. Or just pain. His good leg moved, found the stirrup. Eleanor shoved from below teeth-gritted arms, burning with the effort, and somehow, in a feat of strength she would never quite believe later, he ended up draped across the saddle like a sack of grain. She stood there for a moment, swaying on her feet, her vision blurring at the edges. Then she picked up her valise, took the reins, and started walking. One step, then another. The creek bed stretched ahead, pale stones glowing faintly in the starlight. 1/2 mile, he had said. 1/2 mile. The night sounds began as she walked, crickets chirping in the brush despite the cold. An owl calling somewhere up the canyon, its voice low and mournful. The soft rush of water over rocks from the creek beside her. Eleanor kept her eyes on the ground, watching for roots and holes that might trip her in the darkness. Her feet had gone numb inside her thin boots, and she could no longer feel her fingers where they gripped the reins. Please, she prayed silently, her lips too cold to form words. Please let me find this cabin. The cabin appeared between one blink and the next, or perhaps Eleanor had simply stopped seeing anything beyond the horse's hooves, the rhythm of placing one foot in front of the other, driving out all other thought. Her arms ached from holding the reins. Her throat was raw with thirst. The cold had seeped into her bones until she felt like a walking statue of ice. But there it was, a dark shape hunched against the hillside, barely visible against the trees. The creek gurgled past its western wall, black water catching fragments of starlight. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows. Abandoned, just as the stranger had said. Eleanor pushed open the door. The hinges shrieked a sound that set her teeth on edge and sent something small scurrying in the darkness. The smell hit her next. Old wood mouse droppings, something musty and closed in. Beneath that, the faint char of a long-dead fire, cold ash and creosote. She fumbled along the mantle, fingers brushing rough wood and dust until they found a candle stub. Matches beside it, the box damp but not ruined. The match head scraped, flared. The flames sputtered to life, throwing wild shadows across the single room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, hands stacked and blackened with years of smoke. A wooden cot with a straw mattress, the ticking stained and lumpy. A table with two chairs, one with a leg shorter than the others. An iron pot hanging from a hook over the cold hearth. It smelled like a place that had been forgotten. A place where people had once lived and laughed and loved, now given over to dust and mice and silence. But it had walls. It had a roof, even if she could see gaps where the stars peeked through. It would have to do. Getting the man inside took the last of her strength. Eleanor dragged him inch by painful inch through the door, across the rough plank floor and onto the cot. His skin was the color of old candle wax, except for two spots of fever red high on his cheeks. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but the edges were ragged and angry, already beginning to swell. She needed water. Fire. Light to work by. The creek was 20 steps from the door. Eleanor found a dented copper pot, carried it to the water's edge. The creek ran cold and clear, numbing her fingers as she filled the pot. She could see the stars reflected in the water's surface, wavering and shifting with the current. Back inside, she set about building a fire. Kindling first. Dry sticks stacked beside the fireplace left by whoever had lived here last. Months ago, perhaps, or years. Crumpled leaves for tinder. The match caught on the second try, and flame crawled up through the kindling, crackling and popping as it found the larger wood. Heat crept into the cabin like a living thing pushing back the cold. Eleanor set the pot of water near the flames to warm, then turned her attention to the man on the cot. His breathing had grown more labored since they arrived. His skin, when she touched it, burned with fever. The head wound was the most urgent concern. She needed to clean it, stop any infection before it could take hold. She had no proper bandages, no medicine, nothing but her own two hands and the knowledge her mother had passed down through years of making do without doctors they could not afford. Eleanor tore strips from her petticoat. The cotton was worn thin from years of washing, but it was clean. She dipped a strip in the warming water, wrung it out, and pressed it against the wound on his forehead. The man flinched. His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing. The eyes of a man trapped in nightmare. Easy now. Eleanor held his shoulders down with strength she did not know she possessed. You are safe. Lie still. He fought her for a moment, his body tensing, hands grasping at empty air. Then the strength drained out of him, and he sank back against the mattress, chest heaving. Eleanor cleaned the wound with careful strokes, the way her mother had taught her. The water in the pot turned pink, then red. She dumped it outside, refilled it, started again. The wound was deep but clean. No dirt embedded in the flesh, no fragments of rock. It would scar, certainly. But if she could keep the infection at bay, he would live. His leg worried her more. The ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny, like an overfilled balloon. Purple bruising spread up toward his knee in ugly blotches. She ran her fingers along the bone, pressing gently. He groaned but did not wake. No grinding, no unnatural angles. Sprained badly, perhaps torn, but not broken. Eleanor sat back on her heels and allowed herself one moment of relief. He would live, probably, if she could keep the fever down, if infection did not set in, if a dozen other things did not go wrong in the night ahead. She needed something to draw out the fever, something for the swelling. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory clear as Sunday church bells. Mugwort for wounds, Clara girl. Yarrow for fever. Look for the silver green leaves by running water. Eleanor took the candle and went back outside. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, but she forced herself to move. The creek bank yielded what she needed. Mugwort grew in thick clumps near the water's edge, its leaves soft and silvery in the candlelight. She gathered handfuls, stuffing them into her apron pockets. Found yarrow, too, its flat white flower heads nodding in the darkness. Back inside, she searched the cabin until she found a wooden bowl cracked but serviceable. A smooth river stone served as a pestle. She crushed the mugwort leaves until they released their sharp, bitter smell, the smell of her mother's kitchen, of childhood, of being safe and cared for. The man on the cot had not moved. His breathing came fast and shallow now, sweat beading on his upper lip and temples despite the cold that still lingered in the corners of the cabin. Eleanor packed the poultice against his forehead, bound it with another strip of petticoat. Then she turned to his leg, wrapped the crushed yarrow around the ankle, tied it firm, but not too tight. She heated more water, poured some into a tin cup she found on a shelf above the fireplace, added a few yarrow leaves. Let them steep until the water turned pale gold. Here. She lifted his head with one hand, held the cup to his lips with the other. Drink this. It will help with the fever. He swallowed without opening his eyes. Once, twice. The warm liquid ran down his chin, but some of it went down his throat. Eleanor eased him back onto the pillow, a rolled-up blanket that was musty and moth-eaten, but better than nothing. Then she sat down on the floor beside the cot, her back against the rough wood, and waited. The fever peaked somewhere in the deep hours of the night. Eleanor lost track of time. She knew only the rhythm of her vigil. Check his forehead, wring out the cloth, press it against his burning skin. Again, again. His body shook with chills even as heat radiated off him in waves. He muttered words she could not understand. Names, perhaps. Fragments of conversations from his past. Once he grabbed her wrist with startling strength, his eyes open, but seeing something far away. Something that frightened him. I am here, Eleanor said, though she did not know why. I am here. You are safe. His grip loosened, his eyes closed. She changed the poultice twice, fed the fire when it burned low. The wood crackled and popped in the silence, the only sound besides his labored breathing and the occasional cry of an owl outside. The darkness beyond the window shifted from black to gray to the pale pink of approaching dawn. And slowly, so slowly, she almost did not notice his breathing steadied. His skin cooled beneath her palm. The trembling stopped. Eleanor let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Her shoulders ached from tension. Her eyes burned from the smoke and the sleepless hours. But the worst had passed. He would live. He woke with the first true light of morning. Eleanor was dozing against the cot, her neck bent at an angle that would ache for days. The sound of his voice jerked her upright. Where he coughed, dry and rasping. Where am I safe? She reached for the water pot, poured some into the tin cup. A cabin by the creek. You told me about it before you passed out. He took the cup with shaking hands. Drank. His gray eyes moved around the room, taking in the fire, the bandages, the strips of torn petticoat drying on the hearthstones. You did all this, Eleanor did not answer. The question did not need one. He studied her face for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, confusion giving way to something harder to read. Suspicion, perhaps, or disbelief. Who are you? Someone who was walking through that canyon. She took the empty cup from his hands and set it aside. Your turn. Who are you? The pause lasted a beat too long. She noticed it, filed it away. Jacob, he said finally. Name is Jacob. Eleanor watched his eyes when he said it. Watched the way they slid sideways just for a heartbeat before meeting hers again. Her mother had always said Eleanor had a gift for reading faces, for knowing when someone was telling truth and when they were selling snake oil. She had honed that gift on the streets of Chicago, where the wrong kind of trust could cost you everything. This man, this Jacob, was hiding something. She did not know what, did not know why a wounded stranger in the middle of nowhere would have reason to lie about something as simple as his own name. But she knew one thing for certain. He was not telling her the whole truth. The question was whether it mattered. The cornbread had gone stale 3 days ago. Eleanor unwrapped it from the cloth, the same cotton her mother had used for Sunday baking, still carrying the faint ghost of her kitchen. The edges crumbled under her fingers, dry and yellow-brown. She had been rationing the pieces since Chicago. One small square, each morning, making them last. Now only 3 remained, and her stomach had been hollow since yesterday. She thought of her mother standing at the old cast-iron stove, mixing cornmeal and buttermilk in the chipped blue bowl. The smell of it baking had filled their tiny rooms every Sunday afternoon, warm and sweet and golden. The one luxury they had allowed themselves even when the money ran thin. Always share what you have, Clara girl, her mother used to say. The Lord sees what we do when no one is watching. Eleanor broke the largest piece in half, then broke one half in half again, weighed the portions in her palms, the larger one for him, the smaller for herself. She crossed the cabin to where Jacob lay propped against the wall. He had been awake for 2 hours now, watching her move about the small space with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, but seemed to see everything. She placed the larger portion in his hand. He looked down at it, looked back up at her. The cornbread sat in his palm like something precious, something he did not quite know what to do with. Eat, Eleanor said. You need the strength more than I do. What about you? I have got mine. She returned to her spot by the fire, settled onto the floor, with her back against the warm hearthstones. The cornbread was dry in her mouth, crumbly and almost tasteless. She chewed anyway, slowly making it last. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. A mockingbird called outside its song, bright and insistent, through the gaps in the cabin walls. Jacob ate slowly, methodically. When he finished, he brushed the crumbs from his fingers and fixed his eyes on her face with an expression she could not read. You were walking through that canyon alone. Not a question. A statement. Eleanor nodded. Where were you headed? She reached into her valise, pulled out the cloth bag of dried apples. 6 left. She counted them twice to be certain, then divided them evenly. 3 for him, 3 for herself. Crestwood, she said. Eventually. Eventually, I was supposed to be met at Copper Springs Station. She crossed to the cot, dropped 3 apples into his palm. The dried fruit was brown and wrinkled, but still good. No one came. Jacob turned the apples over in his hand. His jaw tightened just slightly. A muscle jumped beneath the stubble on his cheek. Met by who? A man named Thornton. Eleanor returned to her spot by the fire, bit into an apple. The sweetness was faint, concentrated by the drying, but still there. A taste of last autumn's orchards. He sent for me. Sent for you. How mail-order bride. She kept her eyes on the flames. The words came easier than she expected. Easier than they should have. I answered an advertisement in a Chicago paper. He wrote back. 3 letters, then a train ticket. The apple turned dry in her mouth. She forced herself to swallow, and he did not come. No. The fire popped. Sparks spiraled up toward the chimney, orange and gold against the dark stone. Eleanor watched them rise and die. The station master said this: Thornton owns the biggest ranch in these parts. Blackstone Ranch, he called it. She looked at Jacob. You know it. Something changed in his face. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that had not been there before. I have heard of it. Then you know more than I do. Eleanor bit into another apple. Chewed, swallowed. All I know is 52 words in a letter. Turns out that was not much to stake a life on. Jacob did not respond, but she noticed that his hands had curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles white against his tanned skin. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's single window, thick with dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Eleanor had changed his bandages twice already. The wound on his forehead was closing well. No redness spreading outward, no smell of sickness. His ankle remained swollen, but the bruising had shifted from deep purple to yellow-green at the edges, healing slowly but surely. She worked in silence, her hands moving through the familiar motions. Crush the herbs, mix the poultice, clean the wound, wrap it fresh. These were the rituals of healing her mother had taught her, passed down through generations of women who could not afford doctors. Jacob watched. It should have made her uneasy, those gray eyes following her every movement. But something in his watching felt different from the men she had known in Chicago. The boarders at Mrs. Patterson's house who let their gazes linger too long. The foreman at the laundry who stood too close when he counted out her wages. Jacob watched the way her hands moved, the way she crushed the herbs, the way she checked his pulse against the rhythm of her own heartbeat. He watched like he was trying to figure something out, like she was a puzzle he could not quite solve. Where did you learn all that? His voice broke the silence rough from disuse. Learn what the herbs, the bandages. He gestured at his wrapped ankle. You knew exactly what to do. Eleanor poured water into the pot, set it over the fire to warm. My mother taught me. She could not afford doctors, so she learned to make do without. She taught you well. She taught me everything she could. Eleanor stirred the water, watched the surface ripple and settle. She passed when I was 17. Consumption. 3 months of coughing and fever, and then one morning she just stopped. The words came out before she could stop them. She had not talked about her mother to anyone since leaving Chicago, had not allowed herself to think too deeply about those final days, about sitting beside the narrow bed and watching the light fade from her mother's eyes. But something about this cabin, this stranger, this strange suspended time between one life and the next had loosened her tongue. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The mockingbird sang. Your father, he asked finally. Never knew him, never knew his name. Eleanor pulled the pot from the fire, poured some into the tin cup. My mother worked in a textile mill. That is all she ever told me about where I came from. She brought him the water. Their fingers brushed when he took the cup. His were rough and calloused, hers red and chapped from cold and work. His hands were working hands, she realized. Hands that had held reins and tools and rope. Not the soft hands of a rich man or a clerk. So you came west, he said, all alone. Was there another way? The question sat between them, heavy with everything it did not say. Eleanor took the empty cup back, returned it to its place on the shelf. The tin was dented, worn thin in places. Someone else's memories lived in that cup. Someone else's morning coffee, someone else's evening tea. Most folks would not have stopped in that canyon, Jacob said. A woman alone, strange man bleeding in the dirt. Most folks would have ridden for town. Would not have blamed them none either. Eleanor shrugged. I reckon most folks have better sense than I do. I am serious. He shifted on the cot, wincing as his ankle moved. You could have left me there. No one would have known. I would have known. That is not... He stopped, swallowed. What I mean is why did you stay? She thought about the question. Really thought the way her mother had taught her to think about important things. Not rushing to fill the silence, but letting the answer find its own shape. Because you were hurt, she said finally, and I was there. It is not more complicated than that. Jacob looked at her for a long time. The firelight played across his face, casting shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He looked older than she had first thought. Not old exactly, but weathered. A man who had seen things, survived things. I reckon most folks would want something in return, he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze, held it. Most folks have not been in a position where they had nothing and someone helped them anyway. Changes how you see things. Something shifted in his expression. The suspicion was still there, but underneath it now was something else. Something that might have been respect, or might have been something more. He tried to stand near sunset. Eleanor saw him moving from the corner of her eye, hands braced against the rough plank wall, his good leg taking his weight. She was across the cabin before he had fully straightened her hand on his arm. What in the world do you think you are doing, testing it? His face had gone pale with the effort. Sweat beaded at his temples. I cannot stay flat on my back forever. You can stay off your feet for more than one day. He ignored her, shifted his weight to the injured leg just slightly. His breath caught. The muscles in his jaw went tight as wire, but he did not fall. See, the word came out thin, strained through clenched teeth. I am all right. Eleanor kept her hand on his arm. She could feel the tremor running through him, the effort it took just to stay upright. You are stubborn as a mule, she said. That is not the same as all right. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. Fair point. She helped him lower himself back onto the cot. He moved carefully, deliberately, a man used to being in control of his own body, unaccustomed to having it fail him. When he was settled, he closed his eyes. His breathing slowly steadied. Thank you, he said without looking at her. For everything. The bandages. The food. A pause heavy with something unspoken. for not leaving me in that canyon to die. Eleanor gathered the empty cup, the used bandages, the mortar, with its residue of crushed herbs. Small task to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. You would have done the same, she said. Jacob opened his eyes, looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Would I? The question startled her. She turned cup in hand to find him watching her with that strange intensity he carried like a weight. I do not know, she admitted. I do not know anything about you. Not really. The fire crackled. Outside the light was fading, painting the window amber and gold. You are right, Jacob said quietly. You do not. Eleanor waited for more. An explanation, a confession, something. But he only turned his face toward the wall and closed his eyes, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the growing dark and the certain knowledge that the man she had pulled from that rock slide was carrying something heavy, something he had no intention of sharing. Not yet, maybe not ever. But Eleanor had learned patience in harder schools than this. She could wait. She could watch. And when the truth finally came out, as truth always did, sooner or later she would be ready. 3 days in the cabin, and Jacob could walk. Not well, not far, but he could hobble from the cot to the door without Eleanor's arm beneath his shoulder. Could stand at the threshold and look out at the creek, the trees, the slice of blue sky visible through the bare branches. Eleanor watched him from the hearth where she was grinding yarrow for a fresh poultice. His back was straight despite the limp, his shoulders squared even when pain pulled at the corners of his mouth. A man used to standing tall, she thought. A man who did not take kindly to being brought low. I can help, he said without turning around. With the water, the firewood, something. You can rest. I have rested plenty. He turned then, and the morning light caught his face. The healing gash, the stubble darkening his jaw, those gray eyes that gave nothing away and saw everything. Please, the word seemed to cost him something. Let me be useful. Eleanor set down the mortar, wiped her hands on her apron. Fine, you can fill the water pot. But if you tumble into that creek, I am not fishing you out. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Fair enough. He did not fall. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he made his way down the bank, the wooden bucket hanging from his good hand. His bad leg dragged slightly, and twice he stopped to steady himself against a cottonwood trunk. But he reached the creek, filled the bucket, and carried it back without spilling more than a few drops. By the time he reached the cabin, his face was gray with effort. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. But his eyes held something that had not been there before. Something fierce and hard-won. Pride. She took the bucket from his hands. Sit down before you fall down. He sat, did not argue. Eleanor poured some of the water into the iron pot, set it over the fire to heat. The rest she left in the bucket by the door. They would need it for drinking, for washing, for the 100 small tasks that kept two people alive in a place like this. You are good at this, Jacob said from the cot. At what? Getting by. He was watching her again that way he had, making do with next to nothing. Most folks would have given up by now. Eleanor stirred the pot, watched the surface ripple and settle. Crying does not put food on the table. My mother taught me that. She sounds like a wise woman. She was practical. That is all. She knew we could not afford to fall apart. The fire crackled. Steam began to rise from the water. Eleanor added the crushed yarrow, watched the liquid turn pale green, breathed in the sharp medicinal smell. You do not talk much about yourself, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Jacob's shoulders stiffened. Nothing worth telling. Everybody has got a story. Some stories are better left alone. Eleanor lifted her head, met his gaze across the small cabin. The distance between them was not more than 10 feet, but it felt like a canyon. You know mine, she said. The mill, my mother, the letters, the train. She set down the stirring stick. I have told you just about everything there is to tell. Jacob's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the window, toward the morning light falling gold across the packed dirt floor. I grew up on a ranch, he said finally. Worked cattle since I was old enough to sit a saddle. It is all I know. That is not a story. That is a sentence. His eyes came back to hers. Something moved in their depths. Irritation, maybe, or something deeper. Something that looked almost like guilt. What do you want from me, Eleanor? The question hung in the dusty air. Eleanor thought about it. really thought, the way her mother had taught her. Nothing, she said at last. I do not want anything from you. She turned back to the fire, lifted the pot, poured the warm Euro water into a clean cloth. She could feel his eyes on her back as she crossed to the cot, knelt beside him, began unwrapping the bandage on his ankle. What did you want from him? Jacob's voice was quiet. Eleanor's hand stilled on the bandage. Him, the man who sent for you, this Thornton fellow. Eleanor peeled away the last layer of cloth. The swelling had gone down considerably. The bruising was fading to yellow at the edges, the angry purple giving way to something gentler. Another few days and he would be walking proper. Another few days and he would leave. The thought came unbidden and she pushed it away. A roof over my head, she said. 4 walls, a place where I belonged. That is all. What else would there be? Most women want more than that. Jacob's voice was careful, measured. Security, comfort, money. Eleanor pressed the warm cloth against his ankle. He flinched but did not pull away. Most women have choices. She wrapped the fresh bandage with practiced hands. The motion's automatic after so many days. I had a boarding house room I could not pay for and a job at a laundry that barely kept me fed. When you are drowning, you do not ask whether the rope is made of silk or hemp. You grab hold and hang on. She tied off the bandage, sat back on her heels. Jacob was watching her with that strange look again, like she was something he could not quite figure out. A puzzle with a missing piece. And if the man who threw you that rope turned out to be different than you expected, Eleanor stood, gathered the soiled bandages. Then I would deal with that when it happened, she said. I would face it the same way I have faced everything else, on my own 2 feet. Night fell slow over the canyon. The light did not fade so much as thicken, turning gold to amber, to gray, to black. Eleanor fed the fire, checked Jacob's bandages one last time, then settled into her spot on the floor near the hearth. The blanket she had claimed was thin and moth-eaten, smelling of dust and old wool. But it was better than nothing, and exhaustion had long since stopped being particular about comfort. She curled onto her side, tucked the blanket beneath her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep came in pieces, scraps of dreams she could not hold on to. Her mother's face, the rattle of train wheels, red dust rising in clouds beneath a copper sky. She drifted up and down, aware of the fire's crackle, the creek's endless murmur, the soft rhythm of Jacob's breathing from the cot. And then in the deep middle of the night she woke. Something had changed, the quality of the silence maybe, or a shift in the air. Crickets sang outside loud and constant. An owl called somewhere up the canyon, low and mournful. The cabin walls creaked as they settled, old wood talking to itself in the darkness. Eleanor lay still, her eyes adjusting to the dark. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the wall, painting pale stripes across the floor. And in that light she could see Jacob. He was sitting up on the cot, his back against the wall, his eyes open and fixed on something she could not see. His hands were clasped in his lap, knuckles white, and even in the dimness she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man carrying something too heavy to set down. She watched him through her lashes, keeping her breathing slow and even, pretending sleep. His lips moved. She could not hear the words. Barely a whisper meant for no one but himself in the darkness. But she caught fragments, shapes of sound in the silence. Should have told her. Cannot. She does not know. His head turned toward her. Eleanor held her breath, kept her eyes nearly closed, prayed the moonlight was not bright enough to give her away. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. The fire had burned down to embers, casting his face in shadow and faint red glow. She could not read his expression, could not tell whether he knew she was awake. Then he turned away, faced the wall. His shoulders rose and fell with a breath that might have been a sigh, or might have been something closer to surrender. Eleanor waited until his breathing changed, until she was sure he had finally drifted into sleep. Then she opened her eyes, fully stared at the ceiling where moonlight made patterns through the gaps, and turned the question over and over in her mind. She does not know what. What was this man hiding? What burden was he carrying that kept him awake in the small hours, whispering confessions to the empty air? And when the truth finally came out, as truth always did sooner or later, which side of it would she find herself standing on 5 days in the cabin, and it had started to feel like something close to home? Eleanor knew where the floorboards creaked, the spot near the door, the loose plank by the hearth. She knew which corner of the fireplace drew the best draft, how the morning light fell through the window in a golden slant that reached the cot by mid-morning. She knew the sound of Jacob's breathing when he slept, slow and deep like water moving over stones, and the different sound when he was awake but pretending not to be, shallow and careful, holding something back. Small things, the kind that accumulated without asking permission, the kind that built up like snow on a roof, weightless individually but heavy in some. She was sorting herbs at the table when Jacob pushed himself up from the cot and walked, actually walked, without the wall to lean on or her arm to steady him. He crossed to the cabin door in 4 uneven steps. "I need some air," he said, not asking, stating. Eleanor set down the arrow stems. "Your ankle is fine." He pushed the door open. Sunlight flooded in, warm and bright, despite the cold carrying the smell of pine and creek water. "Better than fine. I need to move around some." She watched him step outside. His gait was still uneven, favoring the bad leg, but the limp had faded to barely a hitch in his stride. A week ago, she had worried he might never walk right again. Bodies were peculiar things, fragile and stubborn in equal measure. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, gathered the herbs into a cloth bundle, and followed him out. The creek caught the midday sun and scattered it into 1,000 bright pieces. Jacob stood at the water's edge, his face tilted up toward the sky. His eyes were closed, and for a moment he looked almost peaceful. The hard lines of his face softened, the tension gone from his shoulders. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the brush, its song bright and complicated. The water rushed past, cold and clear, tumbling over smooth stones worn round by years of flowing. Then he heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned. Whatever she had seen slipped away, replaced by his usual careful expression. The mask he wore like armor. "Show me," he said. Eleanor stopped a few feet away. "Show you what the plants." He gestured toward the creek bank where wild growth tangled green and silver in the sunlight. "The ones you have been using on me. I would like to learn." She studied his face, looking for mockery. Found none. Just that strange intensity he carried with him everywhere, focused now entirely on her. "Why?" "Because you saved my life with them." He met her eyes straight on. "Seems like something worth knowing." Eleanor considered saying no, considered retreating to the cabin to the safe distance she had been keeping these past days. But his eyes held genuine curiosity, the kind she rarely saw in men, and she had spent too many years being overlooked to turn away someone who actually wanted to listen. "All right," she said, "but pay attention. I do not intend to repeat myself." She taught him the way her mother had taught her. Hands in the dirt, names and uses braided together like thread. Mugwort. Eleanor pulled a stem, held it up so he could see the silvery underside of the leaves. They felt soft between her fingers, almost fuzzy, releasing their sharp green smell at her touch. Good for wounds and infections. You crush it into a paste with a little water. The smell tells you when it is ready, bitter like medicine ought to be. Jacob took the stem from her hand. Their fingers brushed, brief and warm. He turned the plant over, studying it with the same careful attention he gave everything. "How do you know it is mugwort and not something that will make things worse?" The leaves. Eleanor knelt beside another clump, pointed to the distinctive shape. Damp earth soaked through her skirt at the knees, cool and rich smelling. "See how they are cut almost like feathers, and that silver green color underneath. Nothing else around here looks quite like it." He knelt beside her, his shoulder close to hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, smell the wood smoke and sweat, and something underneath that was just him. Eleanor stood up quickly, moved to the next plant. "Yarrow," she kept her voice steady. "The white flowers there. Good for fever, for bringing down swelling. You can steep it in hot water for tea or wrap the leaves straight on the skin." Jacob followed her, slower, his ankles still protesting the uneven ground. But he did not complain, just watched and listened and asked questions that showed he was truly hearing what she said. "What about that one?" He pointed to a low-growing plant near the water's edge, its leaves broad and deep green catching the light. "Doc." Eleanor crouched down, her reflection wavering in the creek beside her. The water was so clear she could see the pebbles on the bottom. Brown and gold and gray. Good for rashes, insect bites, that sort of thing. The root is the useful part. You have to dig for it. She pulled some leaves aside to show the thick root beneath. But you have got to be careful. There is another plant looks similar, grows further from the water. That one will make you plenty sick. How do you tell them apart? Practice. She let the leaves fall back into place, straightened up. Her knees ached from crouching. A reminder that she was not as young as she used to be, though she was not old yet either. My mother made me learn every plant in the woods behind our place, tested me till I could name them with my eyes closed. Jacob was quiet for a spell. When he spoke again, his voice had gone soft. She sounds like a good woman. Your mother. Eleanor's throat tightened. She turned away, pretended to study a cluster of chamomile growing between two flat rocks. The little white flowers nodded in the breeze, cheerful and innocent. She was practical, Eleanor said. That is what kept us alive. They worked their way along the creek bank. Eleanor pointing out plants, Jacob listening and learning. The sun moved across the sky, slow and warm despite the winter chill. Shadows lengthened. The air grew cooler as the afternoon wore on, carrying the sweet smell of water and green growing things. Eleanor lost track of time, lost track of the careful distance she had been keeping. There was something about teaching that opened her up. Words flowing without the usual guards, her hands moving to show what her mouth described. And Jacob listened, really listened. Not the way men usually did, half their attention somewhere else waiting for their chance to talk. He took in every word, asked questions that proved he understood, stored each piece of information away like it mattered, like she mattered. The thought caught her off guard. She stumbled on a root, and Jacob's hand shot out to catch her elbow, warm and strong, steadying her before she could fall. Careful there. Eleanor pulled away too quickly. She saw something cross his face. Surprise, maybe, or something that might have been hurt, before he covered it over. Thank you kindly. The words came out stiff. I am fine. They stood there, the creek singing between them, the afternoon light turning everything to gold. Eleanor could still feel where his hand had been, warm against her arm. We should head back, she said, before dark. Jacob nodded, but he did not move. Just stood there watching her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to show. Eleanor. Her name in his mouth did something strange to her chest, something she had not felt in a long time, maybe ever. She waited. When I am healed up, he said, when I can walk proper again. He paused, swallowed. I will have to go. She had known it was coming, had been bracing herself for it since that first morning he woke up in the cabin. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the words in the warm afternoon air, made something twist beneath her ribs. I know. She kept her voice flat. Careful. You have got your own life to get back to. Yes, the word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Eleanor turned toward the cabin, took one step, two. What about you? Jacob's voice stopped her. Where will you go? She did not turn around. Could not. Crestwood, I reckon. Fine work there. A laundry maybe, or a boarding house. There is always work for women who are not afraid of hard labor. By yourself, that is how I got here. That is how I will leave. Silence, the creek rushed on, heedless of them both. A fish jumped somewhere downstream, a silver flash and a splash. It does not have to be that way. Jacob's voice was barely louder than the water, alone, I mean. Eleanor's breath caught. She turned slowly and found him watching her with something raw and unguarded, written plain across his face. What are you saying? He opened his mouth, closed it again. The openness vanished so fast she almost thought she had imagined it, replaced by his usual careful blankness. Nothing. He looked away toward the cabin. Never mind. Forget I said anything. But Eleanor could not forget, could not unknow the way he had looked at her in that unguarded moment. Like she was something worth having, something worth keeping. She walked back to the cabin without another word, her thoughts churning like the creek over its stones. At the door she paused, turned. Jacob. He looked up from where he had stopped by the woodpile. That man who sent for me. Thornton. Eleanor's voice held steady, but her hands trembled where they gripped her apron. The station master said he is the wealthiest man in the territory, hundreds of acres, thousands of head of cattle. Jacob's face went still as pond water. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked what I wanted from him. Eleanor met his eyes, held them. I told you a roof and walls, somewhere to belong. I did not know he was rich when I answered that advertisement. Did not find out until I stepped off that train and the station master told me. She watched his face for something, anything, found nothing but that careful emptiness. Why does that matter? Because I want you to understand. Eleanor turned away, pushed the cabin door open. Whoever ends up taking me in it will not be for money. It will be for this. She gestured at the cabin, the creek, the herbs drying on the table inside. For somebody who sees me, not what they can get from me. She stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. Behind her, in the golden light of late afternoon, she heard Jacob draw a sharp breath, heard him whisper something too quiet to make out, something that sounded almost like a name that was not Jacob. And somewhere far away in the small town of Copper Springs, a man named Victor Crane stepped off a train, brushed the snow from his expensive wool coat, and smiled a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had been searching for Eleanor Whitmore for 3 weeks now, and he had finally found her trail. The storm came without warning. One moment, the evening sky was streaked with purple and gold, the last light of day painting the canyon walls in colors Eleanor had never seen in Chicago. The next, black clouds swallowed the horizon whole, rolling over the mountains like a great dark wave. The air turned thick and charged, the kind of heaviness that pressed against her ears and made the hair on her arms stand up. Get inside. Jacob was already moving toward the door, his eyes fixed on the sky. His limp had faded to almost nothing over the past days, but now he moved with an urgency that had nothing to do with his healing ankle. They barely crossed the threshold before the first flakes fell. Not the gentle snow Eleanor had known in Chicago, the kind that drifted down soft as goose feathers and melted on your tongue. This was different. Hard pellets of ice mixed with snow, driven sideways by a wind that screamed through the canyon like a wounded animal. Within minutes, she could not see the creek anymore. Could not see anything beyond the cabin walls but a wall of white fury. The roof began to leak almost at once. First one drip near the door, then another by the window, then a steady stream in the corner near the cot. Water running down the walls like tears pooling on the packed dirt floor. Eleanor grabbed the bucket, positioned it beneath the worst of the flow. Water splashed against tin, a hollow drumming beneath the thunder of wind and ice against the walls. Over here. Jacob was dragging the cot toward the far wall where the roof seemed more solid. His bad ankle forgotten in the urgency, muscles straining beneath his worn shirt. The cot leg caught on a raised board. He yanked. His foot slipped in the spreading puddle. He went down hard, knee cracking against the floor. Eleanor was beside him in 2 steps. Let me help. I have got it. He pushed himself up, face tight with pain and determination, and hauled the cot the rest of the way. Water was running in from 3 places now, maybe 4. The packed dirt floor was turning to mud, dark and slick, sucking at their boots with every step. The fire hissed and sputtered as drops found their way down the chimney, turning coals to smoking black nothing. They worked without speaking. Eleanor gathered what she could save. The blankets, her valise, the precious herbs she had spent days collecting. Jacob wrestled the table away from a growing pool, stacked the remaining food on the highest shelf he could reach. His hands were shaking. Hers were too. Another leak opened in the roof. Then another. Then a section of shingles gave way entirely with a groan and a crash, letting in the full fury of the storm. By midnight, the cabin had become a swamp. The corner near the hearth was the only spot still dry. Barely. A space maybe 4 feet square pressed against the warm stones where the fire had once burned. The flames were dead now, drowned by the water that had found its way down the chimney, but the stones still held some heat from the hours of burning before. Eleanor and Jacob huddled, their backs against the wall, the single moth-eaten blanket stretched across both their shoulders. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. The cold crept in from every direction, seeping through their tweeted clothes, stealing the warmth from their bodies 1 degree at a time. Eleanor's teeth chattered so hard she thought they might crack. Her dress was soaked from the waist down, heavy and cold against her legs, plastered to her skin like a second layer of ice. The smell of wet wool and mud filled her nose, and beneath it, the sour smell of her own unwashed body. A week without a proper bath. A week in the same clothes. She had stopped noticing it until now. She drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, tried to make herself small, tried to hold on to what little warmth remained in her core. This was what her life had come to. Crouching in a leaking shack in the middle of nowhere, covered in mud and creek water, shivering beside a man she did not really know. No money, no prospects, No one in the world who knew or cared whether she lived or died. The woman who had stepped off the train at Cambridge Springs Station, clean dress and hopeful heart, in letter clutched in her hand like a promise. That woman seemed like a stranger now. A fool. A child who had believed that 52 words could change her life. Lightning flashed. In the brief white glare, Eleanor saw herself as if from outside. Mud-streaked. Pathetic. A stray dog looking for shelter that did not exist. Her mother would be ashamed. The thought hit her like a slap. She pressed her face against her knees, hiding from the darkness, hiding from Jacob, hiding from herself. Eleanor. His voice was barely audible above the rain hammering the what remained of the roof. She lifted her head, found his face in the darkness. A pale shape. Nothing more. There is something I need to tell you. The words hung between them. Eleanor waited, her heart beating slow and heavy in her chest. I have not been honest with you. When you found me in that canyon. When you asked my name. Thunder exploded overhead. So close the whole cabin shook. Somewhere outside, a tree cracked and fell with a sound like the world ending. And then came another sound, worse than the thunder, worse than the falling tree. The horse screaming. Jacob was on his feet before Eleanor could react, lurching toward the door, despite his ankle, despite the mud, despite everything. The horse. If she runs off, we are dead out here. He threw the door open and disappeared into the wall of white. Eleanor scrambled up, stumbled to the doorway. Lightning showed her the scene in frozen snapshots. Jacob fighting through mud that sucked at his boots with every step. The horse rearing against her tether eyes, white with fear rain, driving sideways in the wind so thick it looked like smoke. She watched him grab for the reins, watched his boots slide in the muck, watched him go down. He fell hard, face first into the mud. The horse's hooves came down inches from his head, churning the ground to black soup. He rolled, came up on his hands and knees, mud coating his face and filling his mouth. He spat, grabbed for the reins again. The horse reared. He held on. For a long moment, it was just the two of them, man and beast locked in a battle neither could afford to lose. Jacob's bad leg buckled. He went down on one knee, sank past his ankle in the muck. But his grip on the reins did not break. The horse screamed again, pulled, fought. Then something shifted. The animal's head dropped. Her sides heaved. She stood trembling, beaten down by the storm, and Jacob pulled himself upright, using the saddle for support. He led her to the lee side of the cabin, where the wind was not quite so brutal, tied the reins to a post driven deep into the frozen ground. His hand slipped twice on the wet leather. Mud ran down his face in dark rivers, dripping from his chin, his nose, the ends of his hair. When he came back inside, he looked like something dragged up from a grave. Mud caked every inch of him. His clothes, his skin, the creases of his face. He stood in the doorway, water streaming off him, and for a moment he looked less like a man than something the earth had chewed up and spit out. Eleanor handed him the blanket. He took it, did not wrap it around himself. Just stood there holding it dripping filth onto the floor, staring at nothing. What were you going to tell me? The question came out harder than she meant it to. Jacob flinched like she had struck him. Nothing. He turned away, moved toward the dry corner, leaving a trail of muddy footprints. It does not matter. It does matter. Eleanor followed him, stood blocking his path to the wall. Rain drummed on what was left of the roof. Lightning flickered. Before the horse. Before the thunder. You were about to say something, and I want to know what it was. Lightning flashed again. His face appeared in the white light, mud-streaked, exhausted, and something else, something that looked like shame burning so bright it hurt to see. Not tonight, his voice was barely a whisper. Please, not tonight. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the mud in his hair, the tremor in his hands, the way he could not meet her eyes. She stepped aside. They did not speak again that night. Eleanor curled into her corner, wet and cold and miserable. Jacob sat against the opposite wall, the blanket draped over his shoulders, mud drying in cracks across his face. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of silence had taken hold. The silence of secrets almost spoken. The silence of trust not quite broken, but badly bent. She must have slept because she woke to stillness. The rain had stopped. Gray light seeped through the cracks, showing the ruin of their shelter. Mud everywhere, standing in water in the low spots, their belongings scattered and soaked. A tree had punched through the north wall sometime in the night, crushing the table and what remained of the second chair. If they had been sitting there instead of by the hearth, they would be dead. Jacob was already up, standing by the door, looking out at a world washed clean and new. He had scraped most of the mud from his face, though traces still clung in his hairline and behind his ears. His clothes were stiff, with dried dirt hanging on his frame like a scarecrow's rags. "We need to go." He did not turn around. Eleanor pushed herself upright. Every muscle ached. Her neck felt like someone had twisted it halfway around. Her fingers were so cold she could barely feel them. "Go, we're away from here." His voice was rough, scraped raw. "This place will not survive another storm. And there is somewhere," he stopped, drew a breath that shook. "Somewhere I need to take you," where he was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow, afraid. "Trust me." "Can you do that?" "Just trust me." Eleanor thought about the night before. The interrupted confession, the shame in his eyes. She thought about all the things she did not know, all the questions he would not answer. She thought about the fact that he had gone out into that storm to save a horse, had nearly died to make sure she would have a way to survive if something happened to him. "Yes," she said, "I reckon I can." Something moved across his face, relief maybe, or resignation, or something too complicated to name. "Good." He turned back to the ruined cabin. "We leave as soon as you are ready." The horse carried them both. Eleanor sat in front, her hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle horn. Jacob sat behind her, one arm loose around her waist to keep her steady. His chest was warm against her back, solid and real through the damp fabric of their clothes. His breath stirred the hair at her temple with each exhale. They had been riding for 2 hours. The canyon had given way to rolling hills, the hills to open grassland that stretched toward the horizon in waves of gold and brown and pale green beneath patches of melting snow. Eleanor had never seen so much empty space in her life. In Chicago, buildings crowded together like teeth in a jaw, blocking out the sky, trapping the smoke, and the noise and the smell of too many people living too close together. Here the sky went on forever, blue and endless, with clouds piled up on the horizon like mountains made of cotton. The storm had washed the world clean. Everything smelled of wet earth and sage, fresh and sharp. The sun was warm on her face despite the cold air. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe that everything might turn out all right. "Where are we going?" She had asked the question 3 times already. Each time Jacob had given the same answer. "You will see." The 4th time she stopped asking. The first rider appeared near midday. He came over a rise to the east, a dark shape against the bright sky. A young man on a paint horse driving a small herd of cattle toward a fence line in the distance. Eleanor watched him notice them, watched him wheel his horse around, watched him ride closer with the easy seat of someone born to the saddle, someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. Jacob's arm tightened around her waist. She felt the change in him, the way his breathing shifted, the way his muscles went taut as wire. The rider pulled up 20 feet away. Dust rose from his horse's hooves, caught the sunlight, settled slow. He pushed back his hat, revealing a sun-darkened face creased with surprise. "Mr. Thornton," he touched his hat brim. Respectful, deferential. "We have been looking for you, sir. Whole outfit has been out searching since Tuesday last." Eleanor's spine went rigid. "Mr. Thornton?" She turned her head, tried to see Jacob's face. He was not looking at her. His jaw was set hard, his eyes fixed on the rider. "I am fine, Tom. Had some trouble in the canyon. This woman here found me, took care of me." The rider Tom glanced at Eleanor. Curiosity flickered in his eyes there, and gone quickly hidden behind the blank face of a man who knew better than to ask questions of his betters. "Yes, sir. Should I ride ahead? Let Mr. Dawson know you are coming in." "Do that." Tom touched his hat again, wheeled his horse, and took off at a gallop toward the horizon. Eleanor waited until he was gone, swallowed by the golden grass. "Mr. Thornton." The name fell between them, flat, hard. Jacob said nothing. His arms stayed around her waist, but it felt different now. Heavier, like a chain instead of a comfort. "That is what he called you." "Mr. Thornton." Still nothing. Eleanor faced forward again, stared at the grassland stretching out before them, the distant line of fence posts, the smudge of buildings on the horizon that had not been there an hour ago. "You are going to explain." Her voice grew stronger, harder. When we get wherever we are going, you are going to explain everything. Yes. His voice was barely more than a breath against her hair. I will. They passed 3 more riders before reaching the gate. Each one stopped. Each one touched his hat. Each one called him Mr. Thornton or simply Sir with the kind of deference that could not be learned or faked. The deference of men who depended on another man for their livelihood. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, curious, questioning, but nobody asked who she was. Nobody said a word beyond their greeting and their assurance that they were glad to see him safe. The buildings grew larger as they approached. What she had taken for a single structure from far off turned out to be many. A main house with a wraparound porch, white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. A long bunkhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. A barn bigger than any building Eleanor had ever seen, big enough to hold a church and a schoolhouse with room to spare. Stables, corrals, outbuildings she could not name. All of it spread across the landscape like a small town unto itself. And then she saw the gate. Massive posts of weathered oak, silver gray, with age, with a crossbeam high overhead. Mounted on that crossbeam was a star. 5 points wrought iron black against the blue sky. Blackstone Ranch. Eleanor's hands went numb on the saddle horn. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel it pounding against her ribs. But everything else seemed very far away. Like watching herself from a great distance. Like a dream she could not wake from. The gate stood open. Beyond it, a packed dirt road led toward the main house. 2 stories tall, white painted rails along the porch, lace curtains in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Red geraniums bloomed in boxes beneath the windows, bright as drops of blood despite the winter cold. A home. A real home. The kind Eleanor had dreamed about in her narrow boarding house bed back in Chicago. The kind she had imagined when she read and reread those 52 words. The horse stopped just inside the gate. An old man came running from the barn, white hair flying beneath a battered hat, weathered face creased deep by sun and wind, bow-legged gait of someone who had spent 60 years in the saddle. He was shouting something, words Eleanor could not quite make sense of. And then he was at the horse's side looking up at Jacob with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. Mr. Thornton, sweet mercy, we thought you were dead. Found your hat in that canyon, all that blood on the rocks. Been searching high and low for a week now. Mr. Thornton. The name hit Eleanor like a bucket of cold water. She turned, looked at the man behind her. Really looked the way she should have looked from the very first day. His face had gone pale beneath the sunburn and the healing cuts. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. And his eyes, those gray eyes that had watched her so carefully for a week now, were fixed on her face with something that looked like a man waiting for the axe to fall. Samuel. The word came out wrong, crooked, not Jacob. He did not deny it. Samuel Thornton. Her voice grew stronger, harder. The man who wrote me those letters. The man who was supposed to meet me at the station. The old man, the foreman, she reckoned, went quiet. His eyes moved between them, relief giving way to confusion. Ma'am, Eleanor ignored him. She was sliding down from the horse, now her legs unsteady beneath her, her hands shaking as she gripped the saddle to keep from falling. Her boots hit the packed dirt. The ground felt too solid, too real. You knew. She faced Samuel, still mounted, still looking down at her with that terrible expression. From the very beginning, you knew who I was. Yes. One word. No excuse, no explanation. You let me think. Her voice cracked. She swallowed. Started again. You let me tell you everything. My mother. The letters. Why I came west. All of it. And the whole time you knew. Yes. The foreman had backed away, was gesturing urgently to someone near the barn. Hands were gathering, faces appearing in doorways and around corners drawn by the commotion. Eleanor did not care. Did not care who heard, who saw, who knew. I saved your life. The words scraped out of her throat like broken glass. I pulled you out of that canyon. I sat up all night when you were burning with fever. I gave you half my food when I was starving myself. And you, she stopped, could not go on. The anger was choking her, rising up from somewhere deep in her chest. And underneath it was something worse, something that felt like grief. Samuel swung down from the horse, slowly, carefully. His bad ankle nearly gave way when his boots hit the ground, but he caught himself on the saddle. Straightened, faced her. I am sorry. Sorry. The word tasted like ashes on her tongue. You are sorry. There is nothing I can say that will make this right. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who had made his choice and was prepared to face the consequences. I lied to you. I tested you. I let you believe I was somebody I was not because I wanted to know. What Eleanor demanded, what did you want to know? He met her eyes, held them. Whether you were real. He gestured at the house, the barn, the land stretching out in every direction. Thousands of acres, thousands of cattle, a fortune in grass and water and sky. Whether you were different from the others, whether you came out here looking for me or looking for all this. Eleanor stared at him. The anger was still there, hot and bright, but something else was pushing up beneath it, something she was not ready to name. And what did you decide? The question hung between them. All around the ranch had gone quiet, hands stopping their work, faces turning toward the two figures standing in the shadow of the iron star. Samuel's throat worked. He swallowed once, twice. You gave me half your cornbread when you thought I did not have a dime to my name. His voice had dropped so low she had to strain to hear it. You taught me about plants like I was worth teaching. You sat with me through that storm when you could have stayed warm by what was left of the fire. He took a step toward her. She did not back away. You asked me once what I wanted from the man who sent for you. I have thought about that question every single day since. He stopped. His hands hung at his sides, empty and open. And the answer is you deserve better. Better than a man who lies. Better than a man who tests people because he is too scared to trust them. Eleanor stood still as stone. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, blew it across her face. She did not brush it away. So you are sending me off? No. The word came out sharp, almost desperate. I am telling you the truth. Finally, all of it. And then I am asking you to choose. Choose what. Samuel turned, pointed toward the house. That room on the second floor. The one with the windows facing east, where the morning light comes in first. I had it fixed up for you for my bride. He paused, drew a breath that shook on the way in. There are dresses in the wardrobe, books on the shelves, everything I could think of that a woman might want. He turned back to face her. It is yours if you want it. The room, the ranch, everything I have. But only if you want it. Only if you can find it in you to forgive a fool and a coward who let his fear make him cruel. The foreman had disappeared. The hands had drifted away, finding sudden pressing business elsewhere. It was just the two of them now, standing in the shadow of the iron star, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold and amber. Eleanor looked at the house, looked at the man, looked at the choice he was putting in her hands. I need time, she said finally. Time to think. Something flickered across Samuel's face. Relief, fear, hope, all tangled together, impossible to separate. Take as long as you need. It might be a good while. I will wait. Eleanor walked toward the house, her boots crunching on the packed dirt. At the porch steps, she stopped, turned back. Samuel. He looked up. Those gray eyes that had watched her so carefully for a week now, that had hidden so much, were wet with tears he was not trying to hide. Those letters you wrote me. Those 52 words. She held his gaze, searching for the truth of him. Were any of them real? He did not hesitate. Every last one. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment. Then she climbed the steps, crossed the porch, and disappeared through the door. The room smelled of lavender and lemon oil. Eleanor stood in the doorway, unable to move. The bed was made up with a white quilt hand stitched in a pattern of interlocking wedding rings. The same pattern her grandmother had sewn back in a time Eleanor could barely remember. A wardrobe of dark oak stood against one wall, its doors slightly open to show the edges of fabric inside. Calico. Gingham. Something that might have been blue silk. A washstand held a porcelain basin painted with tiny roses. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the morning light. A bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes. Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, Little Women. Books about women who made their own way in the world. He had prepared all of this for her, for a woman he had never met. Mrs. Patterson, a sturdy woman with iron gray hair pulled back tight and kind eyes set deep in a weathered face had led her up the stairs without a word, had opened the door, stepped aside, and left Eleanor to face it alone. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she crossed to the window. The glass was wavy with age, distorting the view, but she could see the land rolling away toward the horizon. Fences, paddle moving in slow clusters across the grass. The glint of water where a creek wound through the pasture. His land, his cattle, his creek, his lie. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. What did she want? The question had followed her all the way from Chicago. She had told herself she wanted safety. A roof, walls, a place where she belonged. But standing in this room prepared for a woman who had not existed yet, a bride Samuel Thornton had dreamed into being, she understood that she had been lying to herself too. She wanted to matter. To someone. To anyone. And for 10 days in a leaking cabin she had. The knock came an hour later. Eleanor had washed her face in the porcelain basin, the water cool and clean, smelling faintly of roses from the soap left beside it. She had combed the tangles from her hair with a silver-backed brush she found on the dresser. Changed into one of the dresses from the wardrobe, a simple blue cotton, nothing fancy but clean and whole, in ways her own clothes had not been in weeks. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. The face looking back was thinner than as she remembered. Older, but the eyes were the same. Her mother's eyes, dark and steady. Come in. The door opened. Samuel stood on the threshold, hat in his hands, still wearing the mud-stained clothes from the road. He had washed his face and hands, but dirt still clung in the creases of his neck beneath his fingernails. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. May I? Eleanor nodded. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, stood with his back against it, turning his hat in his hands, around and around. The silence stretched. You wanted an explanation, Samuel said at last. A real one, not what I said out there at the gate. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair by the window, folded her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her, waited. Samuel moved to the center of the room, stopped, his fingers worried at the hat brim, wearing it thin. 3 years back, a woman came to this ranch. He was not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the floor on a knot in the pine boards. Name was Margaret. She answered an advertisement. Same as you, said all the right things, smiled the right way. He paused, swallowed. I married her inside a month. Thought I had found. He stopped, shook his head. Does not matter what I thought. What matters is that 6 weeks later she was gone. Took $2,000 from my safe and ran off with a gambler from Abilene. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. I sent men after her. They found her. Turned out she was already married. Had been the whole time. The gambler was her husband. They had been running the same game for years, moving territory to territory, ranch to ranch. Samuel's jaw clenched. The hat brim crumpled under his grip. When your letter came, your first letter, I figured, here we go again. Another woman with a sad story and sweet words. He shook his head slowly. But something about the way you wrote, I could not stop puzzling over it. Could not stop wondering if maybe this time might be different. He looked at her then. Finally, I was riding to meet you at the station. That is how I ended up in that canyon. I was on my way to you, Eleanor. And then the rocks came down. And when I woke up there, you were. And you did not know who I was, did not know about the ranch, or the money or any of it. You just saw a man who needed help. His voice cracked on the words. And I wanted to know if that was real. If you were real. Eleanor stood, walked to the window, looked out at the fading light. So you lied. I tested. The word came out bitter, aimed at himself. I told myself it was different, but it was not. I lied to you because I was scared. Because the last time I let myself trust somebody, she took everything you had and laughed while she did it. Samuel nodded. I am not her. Eleanor said, I know that. Samuel moved closer, stopped when there was still space between them. I knew it that first night when you sat up with me through the fever. I knew it when you gave me half your food. I knew it every single day. But I could not. His voice broke. Eleanor turned, saw the tears he was fighting to hold back. The way his whole body trembled with the effort of keeping himself upright. I could not make myself tell you. Because as long as I did not say the words, I could keep pretending. pretending you might still choose me when you found out, pretending I had not already ruined everything. The silence that followed was different from before, softer somehow. The anger was still there in Eleanor's chest. She could feel it coiled tight beneath her ribs. But something else was rising alongside it, understanding, or the beginning of it. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "That first morning when you woke up and saw me, I know, you should have trusted me. I know, I do not know if I can forgive you." Samuel nodded. His cheeks were wet now, tears cutting tracks through what remained of the dust. "I know that too." Eleanor looked at him, really looked, at the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a week ago, at the gray coming in at his temples, at the weariness that went deeper than exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had built an empire and still felt poor, who had everything the world could offer and trusted none of it, a man who was terrified she would walk away. "The cornbread," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, in the cabin, when I broke it in half and gave you the bigger piece." Eleanor's voice was steady now. "Certain. You looked at it like nobody had ever given you anything before." Samuel's throat moved. He did not speak. "That is when I knew something was not right. Not wrong with you, wrong with your life. Something had happened to make you forget what simple kindness looked like." She crossed to him, stopped an arm's length away. "I came out here looking for a roof and four walls. That is what I told myself. But that is not why I stayed in that canyon. Not why I carried you to the cabin or sat up through the fever or told you about plants down by the creek. Then why?" The question was barely more than a breath. Eleanor reached out, took the ruined hat from his hands, set it on the bed, "Because you needed somebody. And I was there." Far away on a hill overlooking Blackstone Ranch, Victor Crane lowered his brass telescope and smiled. He had arrived 3 days ago following the trail Eleanor Whitmore had left behind her. A trail of train tickets and station masters and small-town gossips who remembered a woman traveling alone heading west, with hope in her eyes and desperation in her heart. He had expected to find her destitute. Alone was easy prey. Instead, he had found her riding through the gates of the largest ranch in the territory, seated on a horse beside Samuel Thornton himself. The same Samuel Thornton whose testimony had put Victor's sister Margaret behind bars. "Well, well," Victor murmured to himself, his breath fogged in the cold air. "This changes things." He had come to Montana for a simple debt collection. $500 plus interest. Money that Eleanor's mother had borrowed and never repaid. Money that Eleanor, as sole heir, now legally owed. But this was better than money. This was opportunity. Victor turned to the two men waiting behind him. Hard men with hard faces, the kind who did not ask questions as long as the payment came through. "Find out everything you can about the woman," Victor said. "Where she came from, why she is here, what her connection to Thornton is." And then Victor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "And then we pay a visit." He tucked the telescope into his saddlebag. "I believe I am owed a debt, and one way or another I intend to collect." Inside the big house at Blackstone Ranch, Eleanor Whitmore stood at her window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire and gold. She did not know that she was being watched. The man on the hill had followed her across half a continent, and now he stood in the fading light with hatred in his heart. Victor Crane was Margaret's brother. He blamed Samuel Thornton for his sister's imprisonment, and the moment he saw Eleanor riding through those gates, his plans had changed entirely. All she knew was that somewhere in the past 10 days between the canyon and the cabin and the storm, she had started to feel something for a man who had lied to her. And now she had to decide whether that feeling was strong enough to survive the truth. The next morning, Eleanor found old Tom Jennings in the stable brushing down a gray mare with the patient hands of a man who had spent a lifetime caring for animals. 62 years old, according to the cook who had brought Eleanor breakfast. Had worked for the Thornton family for 4 decades. Had watched Samuel grow from a boy to a man. Had been there through the good times and the bad, through Samuel's father dying and his mother taking over, through Margaret's betrayal and the dark years that followed. If anyone knew the truth about Samuel Thornton, it was old Tom. "You are the girl from the canyon," Tom said without turning around. His voice was like gravel in a tin can, rough and worn. "The one who saved his life. I suppose I am." Tom turned then, studied her with eyes that had seen more than most men could imagine. pale blue eyes faded by decades of squinting into sun and wind and snow. He told me what you did, pulling him from under them rocks, dragging him to that cabin. Sitting up with him through the fever, Tom shook his head slowly. Most folks would have left him there, would have figured it was not their problem. Most folks have not been in a position where they had nothing and someone helped them anyway. Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. Fair enough. He set down the brush, wiped his hands on his worn leather chaps. You want to know about him, Tom said. It was not a question. About Samuel, about what made him the way he is. Eleanor nodded. Then sit. Tom gestured to a hay bale near the stall door. This might take a while. Eleanor sat, waited. Tom leaned against the stall arms crossed over his chest. Samuel was not always like this, he began. Closed off, suspicious, afraid to trust anybody. When he was young, he was the most open-hearted boy you ever saw. Believed the best in everybody. Trusted too easy, maybe. His mother used to worry about that, said the world would eat him alive if he did not toughen up. What happened, Margaret, happened? Tom's voice went hard. 3 years ago, she showed up at this ranch with a sob story and a pretty smile. Said she was orphaned alone in the world, looking for a fresh start. Samuel believed every word. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. He married her, Tom continued. Thought he had found the love of his life. And for 6 weeks, she played the part perfectly. Doting wife, devoted helpmate, made him believe he was the luckiest man alive. And then she vanished. Along with $2,000 from the ranch safe and every scrap of trust Samuel had left in his soul. Tom shook his head. Turned out she was a con artist, had done the same thing to 3 other men before Samuel, was already married to a gambler who helped her run the scheme. Eleanor remembered Samuel's words from the night before, the way his voice had cracked when he talked about Margaret, the shame in his eyes. What happened to her? Samuel hired men to track her down. Found her in Kansas City about to run the same game on some poor rancher there. He turned her into the law. She went to prison. Her brother... Tom stopped. His face darkened. Her brother man named Victor Crane blamed Samuel for everything. Swore he would make him pay someday. The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but she filed it away. So Samuel stopped trusting people, she said. Not just people, women especially. After Margaret, he swore he would never let himself be fooled again. Built walls around himself so high nobody could climb them. Tom looked at Eleanor with those faded blue eyes. Until you came along. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Processing. He should have told me the truth, she said finally. Yes, he should have. Tom pushed himself off the stall wall. But here is the thing about being hurt that bad. It changes you. Makes you do things you know are wrong because you are terrified of being hurt again. He paused. What he did was not right. But I have known that boy for 40 years, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Eleanor did not respond. Could not. He is out in the north pasture, Tom said, working with the hands mending fence. He has been out there since dawn. Figured you needed space. Eleanor stood, brushed hay from her skirt. Thank you, she said. For telling me. Tom nodded. One more thing, miss. Yes, that look he gets when he sees you, like he cannot quite believe you are real. Tom's weathered face softened into something almost like a smile. That is the look of a man who has been drowning and finally found something to hold on to. He turned back to the horse. Might be worth thinking about, he said, before you make your decision. Eleanor walked out of the stable into the bright winter sunshine. The snow was melting. She could hear water dripping from the eaves of the buildings, could see patches of brown earth appearing through the white. Spring was coming, and with it a reckoning. Victor Crane arrived at Blackstone Ranch 3 days later. He came in the afternoon when the sun was high and the ranch hands were scattered across the property tending to their work. He rode a black horse with a shining coat, wore a wool coat that cost more than most men earned in a month, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to be wherever he happened to stand. Samuel was in the barn when one of the hands came running with the news. Stranger at the gate, sir. Says he has business with one of your guests. Samuel's blood went cold. What kind of business? Would not say, sir, but he asked for Miss Whitmore by name. Samuel found Eleanor in the parlor, reading one of the books he had bought for her. Jane Eyre, the story of a woman who refused to compromise her principles even for love. She looked up when he entered, saw his face. "What is wrong?" "There is someone here to see you." Samuel crossed to her, took her hands in his. A man named Crane. The name meant nothing to her, she could see that in her eyes. "He says you owe him money." Eleanor's face went pale. "I do not understand. I do not owe anyone anything." Before Samuel could respond, the parlor door opened. Victor Crane stepped inside, flanked by two men with hard eyes and hands that rested too easily near their gun belts. "Miss Whitmore," Victor said, his smile not reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "We finally meet." Samuel stepped between them. "You can state your business and leave Crane. Eleanor owes you nothing." "Ah, but she does." Victor reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a folded document. $500 to be precise. Borrowed by her mother, Martha Whitmore, 3 years ago. Never repaid. He handed the document to Samuel, who scanned it quickly. His jaw tightened. "This appears to be legitimate," he admitted. "Of course it is." Victor smiled again. That cold smile that never touched his eyes. "I am a businessman, Mr. Thornton, not a criminal." Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "My mother borrowed money from you. From my associate originally." Victor shrugged. "I acquired the debt when he passed away. Perfectly legal, I assure you, along with all rights to collection." "I did not know." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "She never told me. Parents often keep such things from their children." Victor's voice dripped with false sympathy, especially when they are dying. They do not want to burden their loved ones with their failures. Samuel felt Eleanor flinch beside him, felt the words land like blows. "How much?" Samuel asked. $500 principal." Victor spread his hands. "Plus interest. Call it $750 to be generous." "I will pay it." Everyone turned to look at Samuel. "Excuse me?" Victor's composure flickered just for a moment. "I said I will pay it." Samuel met Victor's eyes, held them. "You will have your money by morning. Now get off my land." Victor did not move. His smile had faded, replaced by something harder, something that looked almost like hatred. "You misunderstand me, Mr. Thornton. I did not come here for the money." He looked at Eleanor. "I came to offer Miss Whitmore an alternative arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "I own a hotel in Denver. Nice establishment. Always need good help. Miss Whitmore could work off her debt there. Take her about 2 years, I reckon. Room and board provided." Samuel's hands curled into fists. "She is not going anywhere with you. That is not your decision to make." Victor turned to Eleanor. "Is it Miss Whitmore? You are not married to this man. You owe him nothing. Why should he pay your debts?" Eleanor stood frozen, her face ashen. "Because I choose to," Samuel said. "Because the debt is legitimate and I have the means to pay it. She will not be indentured to you or anyone else." Victor studied him for a long moment. Something ugly flickered in his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "my sister spoke of you often, before you sent her to prison." Samuel went still. "Margaret was your sister, is my sister, still alive, no thanks to you, rotting in a cell because you could not accept that you had been a fool." "I accepted it." Samuel's voice was ice. "What I could not accept was her doing the same thing to someone else." Victor's face twisted with hatred. "You ruined her, ruined our family's name. And now," he looked at Eleanor again, and there was something terrible in his gaze. "Now I find you with another woman, another innocent fool who does not know what kind of man you really are." "She knows," Samuel said. "I told her everything." "Did you?" Victor smiled. "Did you tell her about the nights you spent with Margaret? The promises you made? The things you said? That is enough." Samuel stepped forward. "Take your money and go. I have not agreed to take the money. You will take it, or you will leave empty-handed. Those are your only options." The two men stood face to face, close enough that Samuel could smell the pomade in Victor's hair, the expensive cologne on his skin, close enough to see the madness lurking behind the businessman's mask. "This is not over," Victor said quietly. "One way or another, you will pay for what you did to my family." Then he turned, nodded to his men, and walked out of the parlor. Samuel watched him go. His hands were shaking. Behind him, Eleanor let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Samuel." He turned. She was standing where he had left her, pale but composed. Her eyes were steady on his face. "Is it true about Margaret?" "Yes." "All of it?" He nodded. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room to stand before him. "Then you should know something too," she said. When I was in that cabin taking care of you, I found something. A gold ring. Fell out of your pocket during the storm. Samuel's breath caught. I knew what that ring meant. Eleanor continued. Knew you were Samuel Thornton from that night. But I did not say anything. Why not? Because I wanted to see if you would tell me yourself, if you would trust me with the truth. Samuel closed his eyes, felt the weight of all his deceptions pressing down on him. I almost did, he whispered, so many times. But I was afraid. I know. Eleanor reached up, touched his face, made him look at her. And that is why I stayed. Not because I did not know, but because I could see you wanted to tell me, could see how much it was tearing you apart keeping the secret. You should hate me. Maybe. Eleanor's hand slid down to rest on his chest over his heart. But I do not. She stepped back. Pay the man his money, she said. Then we need to talk about what happens next. Samuel watched her walk away, his heart pounding against his ribs. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something that might have been hope. But outside, sitting on his horse at the edge of Thornton Land, Victor Crane watched the sunset over Blackstone Ranch and made his own plans. This was not over. Not by a long shot. The money changed hands at dawn. Samuel rode into Copper Springs alone, carrying $750 in a leather satchel. Victor Crane waited at the hotel dressed in the same expensive wool coat, the same cold smile fixed on his face like a mask he had forgotten how to remove. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Samuel counted out the bills. Victor signed the receipt acknowledging full payment. No words were exchanged beyond what was necessary. But as Samuel turned to leave, Victor spoke. You think this is over? Samuel paused at the door, did not turn around. It is over. The debt is paid. The debt, yes. Victor's voice was silk wrapped around broken glass. But not the score. My sister sits in a prison cell because of you. Do you think $700 erases that? Your sister sits in a prison cell because she is a thief and a liar. Samuel's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man who had long since exhausted his capacity for anger. I did not put her there. The law did. You handed her to the law on a silver platter. I stopped her from destroying another man's life the way she destroyed mine. Samuel finally turned, met Victor's eyes. If that makes me your enemy, so be it. But know this, if you come near my ranch again, if you so much as speak Eleanor Whitmore's name, I will make what happened to Margaret look like mercy. He walked out into the cold morning air, leaving Victor alone with his hatred and his plans. Victor stood motionless for a long moment after the door closed. Then he smiled, a real smile this time. The smile of a man who had just been given exactly what he wanted. Not the money. He did not care about the money. What he wanted was confirmation. Confirmation that Samuel Thornton cared about this woman. That she mattered to him. That she was the crack in the armor Victor had been searching for. Margaret had tried to break Samuel with lies and manipulation. She had failed. Victor would try a different approach. He would break Samuel by taking away the one thing the man had allowed himself to love. The days that followed were quiet ones at Blackstone Ranch. Eleanor spent her mornings in the small schoolroom she had established in the parlor, teaching the children of the ranch hands to read and write. There were 7 of them ranging in age from 5 to 12, and they came to her lessons with the eager curiosity of young minds hungry for knowledge. She spent her afternoons walking the property with Ruth Thornton, Samuel's mother. The older woman had returned from a neighboring ranch the day after Victor's visit, and Eleanor had braced herself for hostility, for judgment, for the cold shoulder of a mother protecting her son from another fortune hunter. Instead, she found an ally. Ruth Thornton was 62 years old with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had run Blackstone Ranch for 15 years after her husband's death, had built it from a modest holding into the largest spread in the territory. She knew the value of hard work, of perseverance, of getting up each morning and doing what needed to be done regardless of how you felt about it. And she recognized those same qualities in Eleanor. Samuel told me what you did, Ruth said one afternoon as they walked along the creek that bordered the south pasture. The water ran clear and cold, still edged with ice in the shaded places. How you found him in that canyon. How you saved his life. I did what anyone would have done. Number Ruth shook her head. You did what you would have done. There is a difference. Most people would have ridden for help, would have told themselves it was the sensible thing, the smart thing. You stayed. Eleanor did not respond. did not know how to explain the impulse that had kept her in that canyon, that had driven her to dig through rocks with her bare hands for a man she did not know. He told me about the cornbread, too, Ruth continued. How you gave him the bigger piece when you were starving yourself. How you taught him about the plants like he was worth teaching. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. He told you all of that? He tells me everything. Eventually, Ruth smiled, a real smile, warm and knowing. He is not good at hiding things from me. Never has been, even when he tries. They walked in silence for a while. The sun was warm on Eleanor's face and the air smelled of melting snow and new grass pushing up through the frozen earth. I know about Margaret, Eleanor said finally. What she did to him. Ruth's face tightened almost imperceptibly, then smoothed again. I imagine you do. I understand why he lied to me, why he tested me. Eleanor stopped walking, faced Ruth directly. I do not condone it, but I understand it, and I am trying to decide whether understanding is enough, whether I can build something with a man who was so afraid of being hurt that he hurt me first. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then she nodded slowly. That is the right question to ask, she said. The only question that matters. Not whether you love him, not whether he loves you, but whether you can trust each other, whether you can be honest with each other even when honesty is hard. She started walking again. Eleanor fell into step beside her. I will tell you something about my son, Ruth said. Something I have never told anyone else. When Margaret left, when he discovered what she had done, he did not eat for 3 days, did not sleep. Just sat in his study with a bottle of whiskey and that gold ring she had left behind, turning it over and over in his hands. Eleanor remembered the ring, the one she had found in the cabin, the one with the initials carved inside. I thought he might never recover, Ruth continued. Thought the bitterness might swallow him whole, and for 3 years it almost did. He stopped laughing, stopped trusting, stopped letting anyone close enough to hurt him. Her voice softened. Then he got your letter, your first letter, and something changed. I saw him reading it at the breakfast table, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, I saw the son I remembered, the one who believed in people, who hoped for the best instead of expecting the worst. Eleanor's throat tightened. He read that letter every day for a month, Ruth said, kept it in his pocket like a talisman. And when he wrote back to you, he spent 3 hours on a single page, threw away a dozen drafts before he was satisfied. She stopped, turned to face Eleanor. He counted every word in that letter, she said. Wanted to make sure each one was true, not one wasted, not one false. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, blinked them back. He should have told me who he was, she said. From the beginning? Yes. Ruth nodded. He should have. And he knows that. Knows it eats at him every minute of every day. She reached out, took Eleanor's hand. The older woman's grip was strong, calloused from years of work. But my son has been carrying that guilt alone for 3 years now. Maybe it is time he had someone to help him set it down. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Victor Crane returned to Blackstone Ranch 5 days after the debt was paid. But this time he did not come through the front gate. He did not announce himself to the hands or ask permission to enter. He came in the dead of night with 4 men at his back in a plan born of hatred and desperation. Eleanor woke to the sound of shouting. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, disoriented by the darkness and the noise. Voices outside, running footsteps, the sharp crack of gunfire. She threw on her robe and ran to the window. Below in the yard, illuminated by torchlight, chaos reigned. Men fighting, horses screaming, flames licking at the corner of the bunkhouse where someone had thrown a burning brand. And in the center of it all, Samuel. He was fighting 2 men at once, his fists flying, his face a mask of fury. Blood streamed from a cut on his forehead, but he did not slow down, did not falter. Eleanor's blood went cold when she saw who he was fighting. Victor Crane stood at the edge of the melee, watching with that cold smile on his face, waiting. And when Samuel finally put down the last of his attackers, when he stood alone and bloodied in the torchlight, Victor stepped forward. Thornton. Victor's voice carried across the yard. I believe we have unfinished business. Samuel wiped blood from his eyes, stood straight despite the injuries that must have been screaming through his body. You paid men to attack my ranch, to burn my property, to hurt my people. I paid men to deliver a message. Victor spread his hands. You took something from me. My sister, my family's honor, our name. Did you think I would simply accept your money and disappear? Your sister took herself. Samuel's voice was ice. I just made sure she could not do it to anyone else. Victor's mask slipped. For just a moment, the cold businessman vanished, replaced by something feral, something broken. She was all I had. The words came out ragged, torn. Our parents were gone. Our fortune was gone. It was just us against the world. And you destroyed her. She destroyed herself. No, Victor lunged forward. A knife appeared in his hand, gleaming in the torchlight. Samuel sidestepped, but not fast enough. The blade caught his arm, slicing through fabric and flesh. Eleanor did not remember making the decision to move. One moment she was at the window, the next she was running down the stairs through the house out the front door. Her bare feet slapped against the cold wood of the porch. Her robe flew behind her like a banner. Stop! Her voice rang across the yard, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Everyone froze. Victor with his knife raised. Samuel with blood dripping from his arm. The remaining attackers looking uncertain, caught between their employer's orders and this wild woman in her nightclothes. Eleanor walked forward, each step deliberate, each step bringing her closer to the two men who stood at the center of this storm. You, she pointed at Victor. You came here for me, for the debt I did not know I owed. Well, here I am. Victor's eyes narrowed, the knife lowered slightly, but did not disappear. Eleanor. Samuel's voice was tight with pain and fear. Get back inside. No, she did not look at him, kept her eyes fixed on Victor. This man followed me across half a continent, tried to force me into servitude, attacked the people who took me in. She stopped 3 feet from Victor, close enough to see the madness swimming in his eyes. I think he deserves to hear what I have to say. And what might that be? Eleanor reached into the pocket of her robe, pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a telegram, she said. I sent it 2 days ago to the sheriff in Kansas City, the same sheriff who arrested your sister. Victor's face went pale. I told him about your visit here, about the debt collection that was really extortion, about your threats against Samuel and against me. She unfolded the paper. He wrote back this morning, seems there are several other women in several other territories who have complained about a man matching your description, a man who buys up debts and uses them to coerce vulnerable women into working in his establishments. That is a lie, is it? Eleanor's voice was steady. The sheriff seems to think otherwise. He is very interested in speaking with you. So interested, in fact, that he has issued a warrant for your arrest. Victor's hand trembled. The knife wavered. You are bluffing. Am I? Eleanor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Your sister tried to destroy this man with lies and manipulation. You tried to destroy him with violence and intimidation. Neither of you understood the one thing that would have saved you all this trouble. What is that he is not alone anymore? She turned her back on Victor. A deliberate insult, a calculated risk. Behind her, she heard him move, heard the rustle of fabric, the scrape of boots on dirt. She did not turn around. Eleanor Samuel's shout coincided with the sound of a gunshot. Eleanor spun. Victor stood frozen, the knife still in his hand, staring at a spot of red blooming on his shoulder. Behind him, Ruth Thornton stood on the porch, a smoking rifle in her hands. I have been shooting varmints on this ranch for 40 years, Ruth said calmly. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. Drop the knife. Victor dropped the knife. The sheriff arrived at noon the next day. He brought 3 deputies and a warrant with Victor Crane's name on it. He listened to Eleanor's account of events, to Samuel's account, to the testimony of every hand who had witnessed the attack. He examined the burned corner of the bunkhouse and the injuries sustained by the men who had tried to defend it. And then he put Victor Crane in chains and loaded him into a wagon bound for the territorial prison. 5 years, the sheriff said, minimum, for extortion, assault, and conspiracy to commit arson. This is not over. Victor's voice was hoarse as the wagon pulled away. His shoulder was bandaged, but still bleeding through the cloth. His eyes were wild, desperate. You will pay for this. Both of you. My sister will be free someday, and when she is... The wagon turned a corner. His threats faded into silence. Eleanor stood on the porch watching until the wagon disappeared from sight. Samuel stood beside her, his wounded arm bound in a sling that Ruth had fashioned from an old sheet. He will not stop, Samuel said quietly. Even from prison, he will find a way to hurt us, and Margaret will be free in 2 years. Maybe, Eleanor turned to face him. When she gets out, she will have to face me, not just you. And I am not the kind of woman who scares easy. She took his hand. Whatever comes, we will face it together. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun caught his face, illuminating the cuts and bruises, the exhaustion that shadowed his eyes. But beneath all of that, she saw something else, hope. You stayed, he said, last night, when you could have hidden, when you could have let me fight my own battles. You came out there and faced him. You needed help. Eleanor shrugged. I was there. Samuel's breath caught. Recognition flickered in his eyes. That is what you said in the cabin, when I asked why you saved me. I know. Eleanor. Her name in his mouth still did something strange to her chest. Still made her heart beat faster, her breath come shorter. Yes, Samuel took her hand. His grip was warm despite the cold morning air. Strong despite the injuries. I have made a lot of mistakes, he said. Told a lot of lies. Let fear make me into someone I did not want to be. But I want you to know something. What those 52 words I wrote you, every single one of them, was true. And if you will let me, I would like to spend the rest of my life proving it. Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had lied to her, tested her, hurt her. At the man who had also shown her kindness, had listened to her stories, had looked at a piece of cornbread like it was the most precious gift anyone had ever given him. At the man she had somehow, against all odds and all reason, come to love. That depends, she said. On what? On whether you are asking me to marry you. Samuel blinked. Yes, that is what I am asking. Then you should probably do it properly. A smile broke across his face. The first real smile she had seen from him since the canyon. The smile that transformed him from a guarded, wounded man into someone young and hopeful and alive. He dropped to one knee right there on the porch, still in his blood-stained shirt, still wearing the sling on his arm. Eleanor Whitmore, he said, I am a man of few words and fewer graces, but I am honest and I will be good to you if you let me. Will you marry me? Eleanor looked down at him, at this foolish, wonderful, broken man who was offering her everything she had ever wanted. Yes, she said, I will. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Copper Springs where Ruth Thornton had married Samuel's father 40 years before. Eleanor wore a dress of white silk that Ruth had had shipped from San Francisco with lace at the collar and seed pearls sewn along the hem. Her hair was pinned up with tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to Samuel's grandmother. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that old Tom had gathered from the meadow behind the ranch, the first flowers of spring, pushing up through the last of the snow. Samuel waited at the altar in a black suit and a string tie, his hair slicked back, his face freshly shaved. The cut on his forehead had healed to a thin pink line. His arm was out of the sling, though he still favored it when he thought no one was looking. The church was packed with ranch hands and their families, with shopkeepers from town and neighboring ranchers who had ridden miles to see Samuel Thornton finally take a wife. Ruth sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, trying to pretend she was not crying. Old Tom stood at the back of the church, too proud to sit watching with those faded blue eyes that had seen so much. The ceremony was simple. The vows were traditional. But when Samuel slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, a plain gold band with no inscription, no history, no ghosts of the past, his hands were steady and his eyes were clear. I promise to be honest with you, he said. Always, even when it is hard, even when I am afraid. I promise to trust you with my heart, in my secrets, in my fears. And I promise to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me. Eleanor looked at him through tears she did not try to hide. What gift? A second chance, he said. At love, at trust, at being the man I was always meant to be. She kissed him then, before the preacher could pronounce them man and wife, and the whole church erupted in cheers and applause. That night they stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and gold colors Eleanor had never seen in Chicago. Colors she had come to love in the months since she stepped off that train in Copper Springs. Samuel's arm was around her waist. Her head rested against his shoulder. In the distance, cattle lowed and horses nickered, and the creek sang its endless song. I never answered your question, Eleanor said. What question? In the cabin. You asked what I wanted from the man who sent for me. I told you a roof and four walls and a place where I belonged. Samuel was quiet waiting. That was true, Eleanor continued, but it was not the whole truth. What was the whole truth? She turned in his arms, faced him. I wanted someone to see me. Not what I could do for them, not what I could give them. Just me, the woman behind the capable hands and the practical mind, the woman who was tired of being alone. Samuel's arms tightened around her. I see you, he said. I have seen you since the moment you gave me that cornbread, since the moment you sat up all night with a stranger because it was the right thing to do. He pressed his forehead to hers. I see you, Eleanor Thornton, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. She kissed him again, soft and slow, tasting the future on his lips. Behind them, the door opened. Ruth stepped out onto the porch carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and a plate of cornbread still warm from the oven. Thought you might want something to eat, she said. Long day. Eleanor laughed, took a piece of cornbread from the plate, broke it in half. She handed the larger piece to Samuel. He looked at it, looked at her, and smiled. Some things never change, he said. No, Eleanor took a bite of her own piece. Some things do not. They sat together on the porch as the stars came out, 3 people bound by love and loss and second chances. The coffee grew cold. The cornbread disappeared. And the conversation drifted from the past to the future, from what had been to what might be. Eventually, Ruth excused herself and went to bed. The ranch grew quiet around them, settling into the deep silence of night. Eleanor leaned against her husband, feeling his heartbeat steady against her back. I was thinking, she said, about what? About Victor, about Margaret, about how fear made them into the worst versions of themselves. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Fear does that to people. Makes them do things they know are wrong because they are too scared to do what is right. You did the same thing, Eleanor said gently. You lied to me because you were afraid. I know, but you stopped. Eleanor turned to face him. When it mattered, when you had to choose between fear and honesty, you chose honesty. You told me the truth. Not soon enough. Soon enough for me. She touched his face. That is the difference between you and them. They let fear consume them. You fought it. Samuel closed his eyes, leaned into her touch. I am still afraid, he admitted, every day. Afraid I will wake up and discover this was all a dream. Afraid you will realize you deserve better. Afraid I will make another mistake that drives you away. Eleanor smiled. Then we will be afraid together, she said, and we will remind each other that fear is not stronger than love. That trust can be rebuilt. That people can change. She kissed him once more, soft and sweet. That is what you taught me in that cabin, she whispered. When you looked at that cornbread like it was gold. When you learned the names of plants because I thought they were worth knowing. When you held me through that storm even though you could barely stand. What did I teach you? That even broken things can be made whole again. That even wounded hearts can learn to trust. That second chances are worth fighting for. Samuel held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. I love you, he said. The first time he had spoken the words aloud. Eleanor smiled against his chest. I know, she said. I have known since the cabin. Since the cornbread. Since the moment you whispered my name in your sleep like it was a prayer. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with starlight and tears. I love you too, Samuel Thornton, and I am not going anywhere. They stayed on the porch until the moon rose over the mountains, painting the land in silver and shadow. Then they went inside to the home they would share, to the life they would build together. And if sometimes Eleanor woke in the night to find Samuel watching her with wonder in his eyes, as if he still could not quite believe she was real, she did not mind. She had learned that some debts could never be fully paid, that some wounds never completely healed, that some fears never entirely faded. But she had also learned that love was stronger than debt, that healing was a choice you made every day, and that fear lost its power when you faced it with someone by your side. The winter's debt had been paid in full. Spring was here, and with it, a new beginning. My friend, I have told you a story about 2 people who found each other when neither was looking. About cornbread shared in hard times and kindness, given without expecting anything back. About the kind of love that does not arrive with trumpets and fanfare, but creeps in quiet like dawn through a cabin window. My grandmother was right as she usually was. God does write straight with crooked lines, and sometimes the longest path is the one that leads us home. If you found something familiar in these pages, something that reminded you of your own journey toward trust and belonging, then this story has done its work. Thank you kindly for walking this path with me.